Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening, aviation enthusiasts, and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. Tonight, on episode number 160, we explore the story of Bazooka Charlie and Rosie the Rocketer. Now, this is a pilot and his airplane who created a rather unusual chapter in World War II history. We'll get into that in just a moment. But first, whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a loyal Warbird Tube fan, we are thrilled that you are with us tonight. Now, if you enjoy our content, we would love it if you would spread the word on your favorite social media platform. And if you are watching, especially on YouTube, make sure you click that bell icon and you'll get notifications when our new episodes go live. All right. Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. If you'd like to find out more about the CAF, our events, our aircraft, local units, or how you can join the fun, just visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Now, as you're watching tonight, if you have a question, just type that in the chat box and we'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off tonight. So joining us right now to talk about his book, Bazooka Charlie, is Jim Busha, and Jim is with the Experimental Aircraft Association, and you can see he has a long list of titles, which means he's like second in charge to Jack Belknap. Isn't that right?
Sweet boy, Steve. I'm not second in charge.
But pretty close. But anyway, and he's been a writer for about 30 years now, and also L5 pilot as well, of Warbird. And I've known Jim for a long time. Before he was writing for EIA, he was a detective in Oshkosh, and I knew him back when I was working in radio covering the police beat in Oshkosh, and also through the Young Eagles program. He helped fly Young Eagles at the airport, Whitman Regional Airport, non-EIA times. So Jim and I go way back, and he's a very talented writer. So Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Just looking at a few of the covers of magazines that you've written for. So, and why don't you introduce our other guest for tonight? Very special guest indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. Thank you for having us on here. But really, this is not my story.
Right.
This is the story of one of the most, as far as I'm concerned, iconic and interesting soldiers of World War II. And I am honored to have been part of this because of our special guest, which is the daughter of Major Charles Carpenter, Carol Carpenter Apacki, who I first met in 2016. Carol,
welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's fun to be here. My first show, per se.
Well, good. It's been kind of a whirlwind for you. I guess we'll start out asking, how much of your dad's story did you know while he was still with us before you wrote this article?
Only bits and pieces. My mother told me a little bit. My dad told me a few stories, but really he never discussed the war. And sadly, I wasn't all that interested. I was pretty shallow as a teenager. And a few stories stick in my mind that are deeply moving, but he really moved on after the war.
Right. Oh, as did so many of the veterans returning. They picked up their life from, if they could, from where they had left off and just continued on.
Yeah. Now I wish that I had asked more questions. That's my biggest regret.
Yes. And Jim, I know you've written stories and interviewed veterans for many years as well. And that's a common theme with the families, is that for the most part, when the veterans came back, not all of them talked about their experiences. Really, many kept it just completely bottled up inside.
Yeah, I think, and not to deflate Carol's wish, but
Right.
I think her father probably wouldn't have talked about the war. He was in the majority of returning soldiers who said they just did their job and carried on. And I've interviewed over 350 veterans, mainly World War II pilots, and the common theme was, I would say, boy, I wish I would have interviewed you 20 years ago. And they all said, I wouldn't have talked to you. The only reason I'm doing this is so my grandchildren know what I did. So, I mean, it truly was the greatest generation.
And in one of the letters my dad wrote, he did not want to come back and be a hero. He just couldn't bear that thought. And, you know, I think because he had gotten some medals and had some headlines, he was sort of treated as a hero, and that was his worst fear. He almost didn't want to come home.
Well, and the two of you kind of have a parallel interest. Obviously, Carol, your dad, but Jim, you were always kind of interested in the story of Major Carpenter before you met Carol.
Oh, definitely. I mean, he was in my top 3 probably. He was on my hit list, and that journey to talk to him ended as quickly as it began because I found out he had passed away in 1966.
Yeah.
So this would have been for me in the early 2000s. And so I unfortunately had to let it go. And really, at the time, there wasn't any real documentation, or if it was very, very small, and some of it was not even factual, written about him, until I received a phone call from a young lady in Ohio in 2016 named Carol Apacki.
And Carol, what was the reason for you reaching out to Jim?
Well, I think it was through Colin Powers. I had met Colin Powers, who restores L4s. He was, and when he came to Dayton, he contacted me. He somehow had my name and address through my cousin. And he said, would you like to come and see a plane similar to what your dad flew? And so we became friends. I gave him some uniforms and things, and we set up a display at the Evergreen Museum in Springfield, Oregon. And then we sort of lost touch. And one night I was just, for the heck of it, I was typing my dad's name on the internet. We had just gotten high-speed internet just to see what I could find. And lo and behold, I see all kinds of references to my dad and his plane. I had no idea. And on one of the World War II war sites, I'll read to you, I saw this, it just jumped off. It said, hey, I've got a reference I'm curious about. It concerns a Major Charles Carpenter who reportedly went hunting German tanks and Army L4 observation plane. Shooting bazookas from a Cub plane would be wildly inaccurate. Well, sorry, I just don't believe it ever happened. So then somebody else added, I have my doubts too. The complete lack of detail in the story makes me a bit skeptical. And someone else added, I'm inclined to dismiss it using a highly technical term, complete bollocks. And boy, that's what made me mad. So by this time, it's like 12 o'clock at night. And I go to my mother's old box of war clippings that she had passed on to me with hundreds of letters and pictures. And I started to go through it about 1 o'clock in the morning. And I wrote back to them at about 3 in the morning, introducing myself as his daughter. And their response were amazing and very satisfying. One of them wrote, well, it looks as if some of us have a trace of hen's ovulation to wipe off our face, but it's well worth it to uncover the real truth of an absolutely amazing story. I had posted newspaper clippings and things like that. Holy living criminy, this is a 5-star thread. Woohoo, never underestimate those damn Yankees. So that's what started my curiosity then. And Colin Powers suggested that I write an article based on the letters and things like I had. And there you can see the picture. Yep. And that's why I contacted Jim. It was really through Colin Powers.
Okay.
And then the most amazing thing happened is on one of the pictures, there was the serial number of the plane. And I get this call from a man in Los Angeles. He was a pilot himself. And he said, guess what? I'm Joe Schilling. And help me, Jim, I've gone blank.
Joe Shields.
Joe Shields, sorry. And he said, I found your father's plane. I just couldn't believe it. And he had found it in Austria, traced it down rather quickly, I think, to a museum. And that's when the whole adventure really began.
Yeah. So Jim, what was your reaction when you got the email from Carol?
Well, I think it was a phone call, and
phone call. Okay.
Yes, and I think Carol thought I hung up on her because for 30 seconds I was just gobsmacked. I was dumbfounded that I was actually talking to Major Carpenter's relative, and only living relative, really, only child. And here she wanted to provide me, editor of EAA Warbird's magazine, her father's story. I mean, I was honored and couldn't wait to read it. But that was only the first strike of the match that really started the wildfire.
Well, let's talk about it. Let's actually outline this for those who are not intimately familiar with the story of Major Carpenter and Rosie. Let's lay it out for them.
All right. So Carol and I agreed to work together on a book about her father. You know, Carol kind of minimizes telling the audience that she went down in the basement and had a box of clippings. I was invited to her house in Ohio and spent 2 days with her and her husband, Ken. And the first day there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and I could keep going, letters, photos, newspaper clippings. Her mother never threw a scrap of paper away, thankfully.
Yes.
As she preserved history. They were spread out. Carol had a very, very nice house, but the entire dining room, living room, kitchen were just a mass of documentation, which really helped us in this journey. These were never before seen, never before read, and Major Carpenter was a prolific writer. So this photo here would be at a very young age. He was born in 1912, same year as the sinking of the Titanic. And he was born in a very rural community near Moline, Illinois, near the banks of the Mississippi, and lived with his mother and father. At the time he was born, he had 2 older sisters. And father was a farmer, but favored other vices, and eventually Carol's grandmother had to file for divorce, and 3 more children came along.
I later learned that my father's father, as an alcoholic and a gambler, had lost the family farm, a 1,000-acre Illinois farm, in a gambling game. And so he left and was never seen again, at least as a part of my father's life. So as you can see from the pictures, these 6 kids grew up in poverty.
So while the rest of the country, it's the roaring 20s, really the only thing roaring in the Carpenter house is their stomachs. But I have to say, and I think Charles Carpenter's upbringing formed the man he was. And again, a very prolific writer, a philosophical writer as well, and I think ahead of his time. Really, I do. And yet, I don't think he had any ounce of fear in his body.
He really turned to books for inspiration and guidance. Since he didn't have a role model as a father, he really focused on reading all the great books that he could get his hands on. He was an excellent student. And at 17 years of age, he wrote a creed for himself. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. I resolved to exert all my efforts toward being a nobler and stronger fellow, a gentleman, a scholar, a friend, and a real man. To the best of my ability, I will ever strive for self-control, self-improvement, freedom, wisdom, courage, generosity, truth, and true nobility before gods and men. I will be better. Charles Marston Carpenter. I mean, I think that really framed, as this is in my reflection now at my age of 80, close to 82, I think this framed my father's life. And as we'll see later in the letters, he was really challenged to follow these values in wartime when he was being asked to do terrible things.
And you think about this, Steve. That was 1929. He was 17 years old, and it's just very telling. I mean, that wouldn't be happening in today's day and age, unfortunately. And I don't know if many 17-year-olds could even write cursive anymore. But it's very telling on what he did. He excelled in sports. Track, football, basketball, whatever he touched, he excelled. He was very, very athletic, but he also had a sense of duty and a sense of duty for the country. And he joined the civilian training corps, where if for 4 years you went to a 2-week camp every year, you would be granted a second lieutenant in the Army Reserve, and he did that. And eventually went to the Roosevelt Military Academy, which you see in 1932, that photo. And
all on scholarships.
And I think he became very, very serious and dedicated towards his future.
Well, and I get that from what you've said, and Jim, we've talked before as well, is that, and with the creed, writing that at age 17, definitely a maturity beyond his years, but also, again, Carol, as you had mentioned, really kind of formed his philosophy on life, and he was able to continue that not only as a young man, but throughout his entire life, post-war.
So my mother also grew up in poverty, alcoholic father, and they met. My mother lived with her mother. My father was a young teacher in Moline, Rock Island, and they met at the Coliseum, where there was dances for singles with all the big bands, and they had a whirlwind romance.
But Carol, I think you need to tell them they actually met twice.
Yes, my mother tells the story as she was with her girlfriend at the Coliseum, and this really good-looking man was over there, and she said to her girlfriend, "That's my idea of a man." And lo and behold, he came over and invited her to dance, and they had a wonderful time, and he asked her for a date, and my mother wasn't very confident, and she got so flustered. She said, "Oh, I think I've got a date with my girlfriend that night." Well, that ended that. And for the next year, she kicked herself over and over. How could she have been so silly? And she went one night when she went to the Coliseum again, he came over and asked her to dance again. And this time she was prepared. And so he picked her out of the crowd twice. As you can see, she was quite lovely.
Yes.
And she said, "You don't remember me, do you?" And he said, "No." And so they went on a date, and 3 months later they were married. My mother said we had to get married because we were so in love that we couldn't eat. So we got married. So this is this young couple. Meanwhile, in the background, the rumbles of war are starting.
Now, Carol, he also had a nickname for your mother, Elda, correct?
Yes, Bunny. He called her Bunny. So that all the letters are written to Bunny.
How often did he write when he was away?
Oh,
how many letters, Jim? Probably 500. I don't know.
oh, I mean, he was writing. I mean, there's more letters that weren't included in the book than were. And you know, some of them weren't full letters. I mean, some he's talking about life, like don't forget to pay the mortgage. You know, get something looked at in the house. If the roof needs repair, you know, whatever. You know, how's Carol doing? So I took the snippets of what's happening during his war in there, but again, he wrote. I mean, that was, let's face it, there's no text messages, there's no phone calls. That was the only way to communicate.
Many of the letters are redacted because it's wartime. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And here's the original house where Carol was born in Moline, and then I went there. I wanted to visit where he lived, where Carol lived, and where he taught before the war. He graduated from college in Kentucky and became a high school teacher. And that's the high school, and that turned into apartments now, and then that's the house currently a little worse for wear than when Carol. But still standing. So I think another motivator for Major Carpenter was his younger brother Gene. His younger brother Gene actually earned his wings and became an Army Air Corps pilot and assigned to fighters early on, and this is before the war. Charles became a ground school instructor and also started to learn to fly, as you can see in this Taylorcraft, that he was part of a Rockets Flying Club in Moline, Illinois. So I think there was a little, you know, brotherly love going back and forth on who's the better pilot. Obviously December 7th happens, and however, days before December 7th, Gene is stationed at Clark Field in the Philippines, and writes a letter home saying, don't worry about, this is, I believe, on December 5th, 1941. Don't worry about me. The Japanese aren't going to try anything. They know that if they rub Uncle Sam's hair, you know, we're going to give them what's coming. Unfortunately, on December 7th in Hawaii, it's December 8th in the Philippines, and the Japanese attacked the Philippine Islands. Gene Carpenter's plane, the one he flew, along with many others, are destroyed by the Japanese. And Gene, unfortunately, you know, becomes part of a defense force as hundreds of thousands of Japanese are invading the Philippines.
I found a very poignant poem in my mother's things that she had saved, and this is just one little excerpt that Gene had written. The brains are on the rock, the soldiers in the field. MacArthur's miracle men are not about to yield. One last request I have, though I'm not afraid to die. Pray God that death don't find me here, still on Bataan, PI. It's such a poignant poem because that's where he was captured by the Japanese, went on the Bataan Death March, and was taken as a prisoner of war to Japan, where he died. So that was the prelude to my father entering the war.
So, and as a second lieutenant, you know, Charles Carpenter is called for duty, and in March of 1942, reports to a base in Illinois. He thinks he's going to go to a artillery unit, and they say, no, we need instructors to instruct new officers. So we're going to send you to the shores of Miami Beach. So he takes his car and drives across country. And actually, what's very interesting is he describes leaving Illinois and describing the drive and the scenery and, you know, what you're actually seeing. During 1942, you have gas rationing, you have minimum use of lights, you have tire rationing, but yet he's watching a country rally together. In one case, he picks up a hitchhiker who turns out to be a merchant marine who was sunk by a German U-boat off the coast of Iceland. And he said, my parents think I'm dead. I haven't been able to contact them. So he got him as far as he had to go and then continued on his journey to Miami Beach.
Wow.
So it's in Miami Beach. He starts teaching new officers how to be officers, and yet he's worried about his brother in the Philippines. He has no idea the status of him, whether he's a prisoner, whether he's still just defending the island, and he feels that he's not doing his part. He's watching the Navy dropping depth charges off the coast of Florida, looking for German U-boats that were in fact sinking cargo ships. I don't think a lot of people realize that, but the war was very, very close to home. Aviation obviously was always on his mind, and he decided to become a glider pilot. So he joined the glider ranks. From there, the glider pipeline started to fill up very, very quickly. He went to bases in Tennessee, Arkansas, South Carolina, and then one day, I think it's early 1943, he sees a note on a bulletin board that they're looking for a new type of pilot called a liaison pilot. He had no idea what it was, but he knew that if he stayed with the glider program, he would be stuck for months before his name was called to get checked out. So he signs up, and he's allowed to join the liaison unit and is sent initially to Texas and then to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. So it's while he's in Oklahoma, he completes his liaison course in Aranca L3s, Piper L4s, and here you're seeing a picture of what really was a Piper J3 in civilian life. Cute little yellow airplane, black little lightning bolt, you know, that really helped teach a country to fly. But it was a sheep, or I'm sorry, it was actually a wolf in sheep's clothing when it wore green Army olive drab, becoming the L4. This is what his primary front office was for the remainder of his military service. So after he completes his training in Fort Sill and earns his L wings with the L insignia on it, he's assigned to General Patton's 3rd Army, and they're training in the deserts of California. While in California, he is assigned a general by the name of John Shirley Wood, who was broad in the shoulders and broader in the waist. And Major Carpenter had to shoehorn him into the back seat of the L4, knowing full well that they were overweight. You know, they carried a radio in the back, but I mean, this is a general, and the general had a special relationship with Major Carpenter. They developed a bond. Both of them played tennis. Both of them were voracious readers. And you got to remember, Charles Carpenter was a little older than the common 19, 20-year-old. I mean, I guess he was considered an old man in his late 20s. So they did a lot of training in preparation, obviously, for what was to come when they went to Europe.
And it was to become an important relationship for the rest of the war.
Yes. So this is Major Carpenter in charge of basically his liaison unit, part of the 4th Armored Division of the 3rd Army, and he wrote about flying. He loved it. He loved flying that L4, and he couldn't wait to quickly end this war and get into combat, and he wanted to do his part. While he's there, he does travel back home, and he meets a new, freshly arrived package called Carol.
He wrote to my mom, "Sweetheart, I'm one of the luckiest guys in the whole world. One of the best breaks I ever got was when I captured you and later through you, Carol Ann. If my luck doesn't wear out, I'll have you both for a long time." These very sweet letters are at least half of the letters, but you'll see there comes a darker turn. And I think this is an important part of the story.
And early on, he did earn a nickname called Lucky Carpenter, and you'll learn why more. But when he gets to Europe in January of '44 in England, lots going on, obviously, lots of preparation for the invasion, and they are stationed in various parts of England training, and it's there in June of '44. The invasion on June 6th has already occurred. But he was concerned not only for himself, but his fellow pilots. And he knew a Piper L4 was unarmed. And he didn't feel very comfortable about that. He didn't feel comfortable orbiting over a battlefield and having nothing to shoot back with. Again, he was an athlete with an appetite, and an athlete that never lost. Defeat was not in his vocabulary whatsoever. So he convinced his commanding officer that, hey, can we borrow a couple bazookas from these Army guys and strap them to the wings of this airplane? And there was another pilot who had tried this before and successfully did it. You know, they thought they were going to blow their tails off. They thought that the bazookas on the wings would cause instability, but you know, with the air flowing through those open tubes, it didn't. And the first pilot that did it said, yeah, I can do it, but it's a suicide mission. you have to dive, and get within 100 to 75 yards of the enemy, and you guys are crazy. So he says, well, let's go try it. So they have his commanding officer try it, and he said, it works, but I cannot give you permission, nor can I deny you. That call is up to you. So several of Major Carpenter's pilots strapped 1 and 2 bazookas to their wings. Eventually, Major Carpenter said, you know what, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to strap 6 to my wings. And that's what he did. So here's just just one of the letters. I mean, this is the front office of an L4 Cub. And this is the actual data plate of his L4, which he later nicknamed Rosie the Rocketer, in honor of Rosie the Riveters that he met in California. And he was highly impressed with what he saw on what women were doing for this country, while a majority of men were, fighting the war. Anywhere from women driving taxi cabs, bucking rivets, security, engineers, and delivering milk. He was so impressed with, I don't think a lot of credit has been given to our women who did so much and kept this country going. And he wanted to honor them with that name of Rosie the Rocketer. He starts taking reporters up with him. So Steve, if you could go back in time with your media background, you may have been able to hop a ride with Major Carpenter, but
could I read, Jim, just a brief description that I found of Ken Coyan, who is a reporter, got a ride and sitting in the back of the plane, and he describes it. He said, a flight in Major Charles Carpenter's bazooka shooting Cub observation plane is something like a ride in a roller coaster equipped with skyrockets. Major Carpenter said, my plane isn't very maneuverable with 2 people in it, as he flew over the front. And then he said, hey, there are 2 German tanks down there. Diving almost vertically to less than 300 yards of the ground, Carpenter fired 2 of the rockets, 1 from each wing. There was a flash of flame. Rosie stuck her nose up in a steep climb. I allowed too much for the wind, the major grinned. Again, the Cub dived and 2 rockets flashed groundward to a massive German Panther. Black puffs of anti-aircraft shells spotted the sky. And with that, Rosie turned leisurely back to her hillside pasture for another load of gas and rockets. That's such a vivid image.
But Lucky Carpenter's luck came to an end on August 1st of 1944, temporarily. As Patton's armies are racing across Europe, the Germans are in retreat. Major Carpenter is in a Jeep looking for his next field for not only him, but his fellow pilots. And, obviously they're within a mile or 2 of the front lines. And those front lines kept moving and moving and moving at a very rapid rate. So he spots a Sherman tank that is stalled overlooking a town. And he goes up to them and says, what's going on? Well, it's heavily defended. We're not moving in. We've got to wait for more reinforcements. Well, again, Major Carpenter, as the charge-all guy he was, said that town's not heavily defended. There's maybe a gun in there, maybe a German 88, which to me is heavily defended. I mean, that's a bad gun. And he climbs on the tank, charges a 50 caliber, and says, "Let's go." Well, they've got an officer on the tank. They start going into town. He starts ordering them to shoot at targets. They do find it was lightly defended, but there was German opposition in there, and several German tanks. On the third corner that they turned, and he yelled fire, it happened to be a Sherman tank with a plow blade on it, which that's what they hit. However, no damage, slight damage. No one was hurt in the Sherman tank. The town is cleared. The troops are cheering him on until the tank cruise officer comes on scene and says, how did you guys do this? What's going on? And they all point to the guy wearing the leather jacket with the 45 shoulder holster and the L-wings. And he says, what in the hell was a liaison pilot doing on that tank? Place him under arrest. So they strip him of his jacket. They strip him of his sidearm. And in a letter home, they strip him of his dignity. Because he was just trying to do his job. So while he's in confinement, word spreads. Privates talk to corporals, corporals talk to sergeants, sergeants talk to lieutenants, and so on and so on. Well, his commanding officer, John Shirley Wood, became aware of it and was enraged that they were holding his pilot. So he had him released. He had him assigned. He was no longer in charge of the liaison unit. He was now solely to report to John Shirley Wood and basically given permission to do what you want to do. And that's when the gloves came off and he became a one-man wrecking crew.
Wow.
And I think something snapped in my dad, because this is when the letters start to take a darker turn from very lovely love letters to my mother. At one point when I was reading this letter, you can imagine how shocked I was, as well as my mother must have been. As things appear from where I stand now, I shall probably not ever return home at the end of the war. The old life is pretty much gone for me, although you and home are as lovely and sweet as ever. From now on, I must be free to speak my mind and follow what I believe to be the true course for the most concerned. I shall continue to share with you all that I have. Although other than that, much of your own destiny is in your own hands. Many men lose ideals in a war such as this. A few of mine have taken on a new luster. I have seen burning homes and needlessly devastated cities and villages. And amid scenes of confusion and panic, I did what I thought was right. In all cases, I've helped the situation. The individual should no longer count for much when so much else is at stake. I have become a very bad risk as a father and a husband. At times, I am so restless and impatient that I scarcely know myself. It's such a shock of a letter.
Imagine all of the horrors that he has seen. I mean, he came from a teacher, seeing now the youth of France devastated, and that was difficult for him. That was very.
I realized. Oh, sorry, Jim.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I realized that my dad was, as a reconnaissance, reporting back to General Wood where the German tanks were. And then the army would follow, the artillery. And, and my dad would fly back over the field and see the devastation that resulted. And that happened day after day after day. And this is why I understand didn't think he could ever come back and be a normal husband and father ever again. This is what many men were going through.
I mean, he starts to have, every mission was serious, but there were several that were not only reported on in the press, but also with the letters home. Of course, the letters home he kind of minimizes his involvement.
Of course.
But I mean, in one instance, the Germans have a counterattack against the Fourth Armor, and it's getting pretty hairy. They use the cover of fog to advance. He's sitting on the ground, listening like you would back then to a baseball game on the radio, on a play-by-play of what's going on, and he's stuck. However, the fog eventually clears by noon, and he takes off. And that day alone, he's credited with over 2 tanks, untold other vehicles, but he made 3 separate trips for fuel and rockets, and didn't stop. And actually, some of that is because of his efforts to repel that advance. That is an actual photo of Rosie the Rocketeer in the air in France.
And Jim, there were men under the bridge that were trapped. I found a newspaper clipping, and by my dad going back and forth and firing at the German tanks and disabling them, the men were able to be freed from the bridge and return home.
So there's many examples of that in the book of his heroic actions, again, which he did not want to be labeled a hero. He was not looking for publicity. Actually, he scolded Bunny in a letter saying, ignore these people that keep writing you, because he was becoming, in all essence, a star. And he told her, don't respond to these people. I don't want the notoriety. And of course, a wife at home is reading about her husband. She's very, very proud of that, of his actions, but he didn't want that.
Do you think that attitude that he had, that he didn't want to be considered a hero, he was downplaying what he was doing, is that maybe a contributing cause to why this story was, I don't want to say relegated, but it was never fully, until this book, it was never fully explored, and almost became, like Carol found out, it was like an internet, urban legend, right? This didn't really happen. So am I interpreting that correctly, that his attitude probably contributed to the story just sort of being dormant in history?
You are spot on. You're 100%. He was an urban legend. Yeah. And I really truly believe that if Major Carpenter had been alive when I was interviewing veterans, and sadly, we just lost Bud Anderson, many of them have gone west. But I think he would have said, no, thank you. I don't want to talk to you. That's truly, however, and I think we'll get to this later in this interview, there was another side of him that was about turning boys into men. That's what was important to him, not the war. The only thing important about the war was getting it over as quickly as possible so these civilians wouldn't have to suffer, so his fellow soldiers wouldn't have to suffer. That was his driving force. Had nothing to do with, I want more notoriety. Nothing like that. But you hit it on the head.
I do think my dad was dealing with some PTSD as well.
Yeah.
I really do.
Yeah.
It took on a kind of a restless. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. I think that's where the creed comes to play again. That contrast, where you're really, involved in being asked to do terrible things.
And again, as far as his writings, as you'll see if you order this book, I didn't want to change that. I wasn't going to change who he was. And many of the subs of these letters are, in his own words, not changed at all. He also was a poet, and he wrote many poems including one which was very, very dark, but very well written, where he takes a rider up with him, and he's flying over the battle, flying through these silky clouds, until you realize death is the passenger, and that's who he has in his back seat. But it's a telling poem about what's going on the battlefields of Europe at that time. So as the 4th Armored advances very, very quickly, maybe some of Major Carpenter's a little bit of forcefulness rubbed off on his general. Unfortunately, his general, John Shirley Wood, got in a little hot water, and rightly so, because he was sticking up for his troops, and argued with another general who reported him to General Patton. And he and General Patton had been at West Point together in 1908, and along with General Eisenhower and many other very famous generals. That class was a superstar class, if you will. But General Patton told his old friend, "I think it's time you go home and take a rest." So he sent them back to the United States. There's a new commanding officer, and Major Carpenter now is just relegated to flying liaison missions. That he gets sent to Paris for a school in mid-December of 1944, and that also happens to be right around the Battle of the Bulge. He gets back to his unit in time to partake in some of the after action of the Battle of the Bulge up until late January of 1945. And he reports to his flight surgeon that, I've got this odd lump in my neck. I think I might have twisted my neck. I don't know what's going on with me. And the doctor looks at it and says, yeah, nothing I can see, but I'm going to send you to Paris to get checked out. I want you to see the doctors there. So he gets sent back in February of 45, and then it's discovered what he has in his neck, and I'll let Carol talk about that.
Well, he's writing these letters to my mother, sort of dismissing it, but this big note was removed. They didn't quite know what it was. So he was sent back to the United States, and it's there that he is diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease and given a year to live. And so that's where he came home at Christmas time. I remember him coming home. He was quite, I can remember that Christmas. I think I was about 4 years old, and my dad was quite stern. I think coming back from the shock of World War II, coming back to civilian life, sick with a year to live. And I remember ripping through my Christmas gifts and my dad storming out of the room. I think the contrast of what he had seen in France at the time with hungry children and this little spoiled 4-year-old was more than he could bear. So when he came home, it wasn't easy at the beginning. It really wasn't. And we sold our house, and my dad wanted to see the West, and so we drove out west before he died so he could see the West and visit family. And then he came back, but he was feeling pretty good. So we ended up, we moved to Champaign, Illinois, where we bought a house where I could go to college someday, and planning for my father's death, but he continued doing fine. And each year they would take out more nodes from his neck and his back and under his arm, usually at Christmas time. but he always revived and restored, and actually lived for 25 more years of a rich and happy life, and ran a boys camp in the summer for boys, as Jim's the focus was on using that creed that shaped his life in teaching young boys how to become men. He was a beloved high school teacher, and when he did die, the kids at the school gave him he had many yearbooks dedicated to him. He really lived a wonderful life, and so the image of my dad as a war hero is only a small part of who he really was. I was going to look for the quote here where the high school kids gave him a wonderful dedication.
While she's looking, keep looking, Carol.
Yeah, here it is. I'll just read this and I'll let you go. It is perhaps impossible to do Mr. Carpenter justice. He was a war hero who never spoke of the war, a rugged athlete who also wrote poetry, a gentleman who spoke with tolerance and wisdom. This he was and more. I think that really sums up who my dad was.
I was going to say, Steve, when he's sent back home with his diagnosis, I mean, the letters back, he was very, very frustrated because he could see the war winding down in Europe, but wanted to go and continue the fight to Japan. And now this little lump in his neck was preventing him from continuing that, to see it finish to the end. So eventually his L4 is reassigned to another pilot, and for all we knew, faded away into history. I mean, let's face it, this aircraft was built for the sole purpose of an Army liaison plane with maybe a 400-hour lifespan. I mean, that's not a very, very long time. It's fabric, it's tube. I mean, no one would have thought what was about to be discovered.
Yeah. And with that, we are just about out of time. So what I'm going to suggest is we've explored Major Carpenter and his life, and we might have to have you both back to explore the rebirth of Rosie the Rocketer, because that story is as fascinating as the one we've just explored. But I do have a couple of questions, and one of our viewers tonight, Richard Staples, as you were talking about your father, he said, with his code, he said, essentially, Richard writes, Major Carpenter lived the Christian Knight's code, in my opinion, considering his manly grace. So, his writings and what we've talked about tonight continues to inspire.
Yeah, I'm so interested why there's so much. I'm intrigued why there's so much interest in my dad, and I think we're hungry for heroes. And my dad really was a hero. He was flawed for sure, but I think there's something about his character that continues to fascinate people, and I think Jim's book reflects that.
Oh, it definitely does.
That's a beautiful. Thank you, Richard, for your kind words. I appreciate that.
And with that, we're, like I said, just about out of time. Any final thoughts that you'd like to add, Jim?
Yeah, I'd like you to share with everyone on how they can read more about this story. And again, it's not my book; it's right. Major Carpenter's book. I just happen to be honored to work with his daughter Carol and help present and preserve history for future generations.
And for my grandchildren. I'm very grateful for Jim for getting the story and putting it together. Now I really know the full story. It was like pieces. I had bits and pieces, and now the puzzle is complete.
Yeah. And as Jim mentioned, if you're interested in a copy of the book, it's available at EIA's online store. It's shop.eaa.org. They have signed copies. You've both signed them?
I know we did during AirVenture last year. I don't know if any of those are left over or not. We can certainly work on that.
Sure. There you go. shop.eaa.org. Grab the book. And again, I'm hoping that we can have you back maybe later this summer and talk about the restoration of the airplane, because, as I said, it's a very fascinating story in itself. And Carol, I'll give you the floor for sort of some wrap-up comments about your father and the things that you discovered along the way.
Well, I just realized in reflection that heroes come in many forms, and we didn't get a chance to talk about my mother much, but I realized that my mother was as much a hero as my dad. My dad, at many points in the war, I think was falling apart, or at least in dealing with some PTSD. And it was my mother, for all her lack of confidence in herself. My mother had a 9th grade education. She was the one who really held things together and was able, through her love and forgiveness, was able to keep the marriage going. And it was rough, as you'll see in the story of the book. So their heroes come in many forms. And I think the reason I was willing to share this story, because it's a personal story. It's a complicated love story that we really didn't get into. That it was my mom who through love was able to carry on. And I think that reflects what many wartime brides, wartime mothers, they are as much a hero as the men on the front. And I also learned that our parents have much more interesting lives than we ever dreamed. And you won't know it if you don't ask.
Very good advice. You're right. You won't know unless you do ask. So again, if you'd like a copy of the book, shop.eaa.org. Carol, Jim, thank you for being with us tonight. It's been a very quick hour. I looked at the clock and it was, our time is up before it seems like before it even started. But again, thank you for sharing the story, and really, I think we're going to have a second session on this. And thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. We'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's episode or any ideas you have for a future topic. Please feel free to just drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. And if you enjoyed the show tonight, please share it across your social media platforms. And remember to subscribe and click that bell icon to get notifications when new episodes of Warbird Tube are posted. I'm Steve Buss, and until next time, wishing you blue skies and tailwinds. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.